In 2024, 299.4 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance and protection. Preventing, mitigating, and responding to humanitarian crises is a challenge. Can fiction and storytelling play a role? Can it raise awareness and motivate action to address the causes and consequences of humanitarian crises? My name is Ruth Mukwana, and I host the Sahapod Stories and Humanitarian Action, where I discuss this question with humanitarian practitioners and writers. Welcome to the Sahapod Stories and Humanitarian Action. I have a great guest for you today. Before I introduce her, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, like, comment, and share it. My guest today is Maisarah Faisal, who is the Special Assistant to the Executive Director at Sunway Center for Planetary Health, Sunway University in Malaysia. She's a graduate of International Relations with Mandarin from the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. She has experience in research and analysis, new media communications, and youth engagement in both the public and private sector. She's also a youth activist. Welcome to the show today, Maisarah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ruth. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited for all the things that we'll be discussing later.
No, me too. And I know we've been in touch and we've been talking about fiction, youth activism. And in fact, my first question is going to be if you could just tell me a bit about your work in activism.
Yeah, of course. Sure. So, as you mentioned, I'm now at the Sunway Center for Planetary Health, working on research and advocacy on planetary health. And my role specifically has been greatly involved with youth engagement. And so it's more about mobilizing the next generation of planetary health leaders. We recently just released an article on this very topic, and so it's a lot of on the ground work of just studying what exactly is it that drives young people to action, but also at the same time what perhaps hinders them. And this is quite an interesting topic, I would say, because as we know, climate anxiety is on the rise globally, and it's even more prevalent among young people. And that plays a huge impact on whether, what drives somebody to resignation or also just action. So that's largely been what my role has been about.
And what are some of your findings, if you're able to share? Like, what are you finding? What drives the youth to take action?
Yeah, so this is really so interesting, and it really varies. And I think this is still a topic that's in exploration within the field itself, within academia especially. But from my conversations and from our engagement with young people, we found that there's not a shortage of energy and interest to act for the climate movement, at least in Malaysia. But I know that this is also a trend globally. But perhaps a little bit more hindered by either structural barriers of not really feeling like there is a seat at the table for them to participate, as well as just the overwhelming anxiety of everything that's happening, especially because young people are a lot more attuned to social media and seeing news on the daily, and there's just so much information overload. So where do we go about from there? And most of the news that we see are quite negative, so it presents this like doom and gloom narrative. And that's why I think also narratives play such an important role in moving people to action. It's not to say that everything should just be blindly or absurdly positive, but it has to be clear and with a very clear call to action. So yeah, those are some of the observations so far, but it's still a work in progress, and I'm really excited. There's a lot of purpose in the work that we do now, especially working with young people so far.
Yeah, no, and I mean, everyone says if we want to make change, it is really the young people. If the youth, if the young people get involved on an issue, we are likely to see change. And so, I hope once you finish your study that actually we can talk again, or we can talk again about the findings. And before we start talking about narrative fiction and the power of storytelling generally, what is planetary health?
Okay, so planetary health, as I would introduce it in a nutshell, is really the um, interconnectedness of the health of people and the health of the planet. And I think we see this so clearly in light of the COVID pandemic that we are still in, that we don't quite clearly see an end in sight. Is that when we, like, human impacts in itself to the environment has a return impact to humanity and in fact our own health. So in the way that, for example, there's been a higher increase in zoonotic diseases because of wildlife destruction, bringing the interactions of people and animals a lot closer. And with that comes the risk of more infectious diseases. So it's really about studying that and also bringing the awareness that there's a reason why we should protect the environment, but it's really because at the end of the day, it's also about our own survival. The climate change is so very real, and we're starting to see more and more of the impacts clearer now. And if we don't act on it in a way that we understand that whatever we do to the environment has a direct impact to us, even if we don't see it now, but in the long run. So yeah, that's essentially what planetary health is about. Yep.
Yeah, no, definitely. And the book we are going to read, talks a lot about the environment, the impact of the extractive industry on the environment in the village where the story is set. But before we, get talking about how beautiful we were, um, what is your take on this question? And I know you've mentioned it already. Is there a role for fiction to raise awareness and to address the causes of the of humanitarian crisis? And you could even just talk about health or planetary health for that matter, which is actually you're working on. But is there a role for fiction at all? And if there is, what is that role?
Yeah, of course, definitely. And I think it just doesn't just apply to fiction, but it's really in storytelling. Because at the end of it, it's a way for people to connect to each other and understand the human essence. So, how fiction in this context, or just how narratives, how storytelling in general is able to either address the humanitarian crisis or drive humanitarian action, is really because it builds that empathy. As I mentioned earlier, so much of our news now is a lot of doom and gloom. And because of that, when there's so many things, many bad things happening around us, it almost becomes insignificant. Unfortunately, it's really quite sad. And so people become quite desensitized to injustice and to conflicts, the impacts of everything that's happening worldwide, and we forget that behind all those statistics, behind the news and the sound bites that we see on the TV or on our screens, is that there's real people behind, real people and real stories and lived experiences. And if we're only stuck in the bubble that we are in our comfortable lives, if we're not facing those kind of things, then we wouldn't be able to empathize as much. But fiction and storytelling in general kind of breaks that barrier and allows you to feel what a person in this situation might feel. And it might be fictional per se, but when you reflect this against real world events, then you realize that it's really not so fictional after all.
Right. And it's a question I struggle with myself. So, I really agree with you on the empathy and compassion. But one of the questions, I've always often also asked is that, okay, fine, people read a book, they empathize with the characters, but do they then go and do something about the issue the book is perhaps bringing up or the story is bringing up?
Yeah, that's a no, I feel the same way as well. It's a really tricky area because, on the one hand, I think maybe when you think about it like that, is there comes an expectation that fiction could essentially solve, these big issues when obviously it's not. It's a process and it's a it's built upon small things. But what I think it can do is create conversations, and to spread it out within the community, either building awareness or really just conversations to say like, oh, isn't something that we've naturally thought about, because this isn't something that we face. But I read this book, and it's quite interesting. I wonder if there's something that we can do about it, maybe in our small local community. So the question of whether or not it will potentially drive like tangible and concrete actions, I guess it varies. I don't know if there's been like proper studies or anything on this. It'd be really quite interesting to see. But just in being able to influence and sort of change the way that people think and open up a whole new world, I think that's probably it. Just really opening up um, a new world to people who might not have discovered it if it weren't for these stories.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that as well. Because I mean, I could also just add a little bit and say I feel like, it opens up this world, as you've just said, and then people can actually also read more. Some people really read a fiction story set in a particular country, and once they finished reading the story, they actually went and did research about that country. But I also hear stories of people who are like, goodness, I read about this country and I was just so interested. And I even went and, looked for work, in that country, or supported, um, some people, or humanitarian work in that country, because, this story stayed with me. But it is, one of those questions I just really like to be able, if there was a way to really do a study on the link with reading fiction and taking action beyond the empathy and the compassion aspects of it that seem to be a lot of people talk a lot about.
Yeah, I guess if I can just add on a personal basis too, it was really, I wouldn't like attribute 100% to it, but part of what drove me to pursue international relations for my undergrad when I was studying it, was because of a poem that I read in high school. I had a lovely teacher, Panchitra, and she introduced me to this poem, "The Man He Killed" by Thomas Hardy. And it's really just about how two people met, I guess faced opposite each other in the lines of war, would end up killing each other, when in fact, if they had met at some old ancient inn somewhere else at a bar or something, they might have become friends. So it really completely opened my eyes as a 17-year-old to think that, oh, this is quite funny and quite ridiculous to think that the things that we do is almost like, it's a social construct. And I it really just drove me to understand it a little bit better, and to understand how people view each other in this whole us versus them sentiment, and how much of how we have built our own identities against another identity, and to what extent are we willing to, I guess, bolster our own identity. And in this, sadly, in these cases, would be in terms of conflicts and wars, right, and dividing the lines even further. So yeah, and I think it's an issue that we see so clearly now as well, with the increasing sociopolitical polarization. But yeah, it just for me, it's opened up a whole new world, because I didn't think about it. I never thought that this was something um, that could happen, at least like from that perspective. And it all was rooted from just one poem.
Right. And I know you wanted to read that poem as well, and I'm glad actually you've already mentioned it as well. The Man He Killed by Thomas Hardy is the poem. And,
Yes.
yeah, you can read it. I know you wanted to read it as well.
Sure, yeah. I guess I've already explained a little bit of what it was, but um, so it goes like, had he and I but met by some old ancient inn, we should have sat down to write many a nipperkin. But ranged as infantry and staring face to face, I shot at him as he at me, and killed him in his place. I shot him dead because he was my foe. Just so, my foe, of course he was. That's clear enough, although he thought he would enlist, perhaps offhand, like, just as I was out of work, had sold his traps, no other reason why. Yes, quaint and curious war is. You shoot a fellow down, you would treat if met where any bar is, or help to have a crown. So it's for a 17-year-old, it was really, and even up till now, it's really quite profound. Just how much that we've defined our own worlds because of this.
No, it's such a beautiful poem, and I mean poem. And I know I don't discuss poems ordinarily, but poems also just have this ability to do so much and convey so much um, in such short space or such a short period, or in so very few words. And that, when it starts, the poem itself, saying if we had met, somewhere else at a bar, we would have been friends, we would have had a drink.
Mhm.
But, we meet in a war conflict situation and we are shooting at each other. I mean, it just really makes you pause and,
Yeah,
and, and really think about what war does to people as well.
it really does. It really does. And just makes you, I guess, pause is the right word to just rethink what does this all mean and why do we divide our identities? Why do we divide our worlds like this when really the human essence is still to connect? And I mean, at least I think I like to think that I'm an optimist still, but there's still a lot of good in humanity.
Yeah. And I mean, the interesting thing as well, and we're just gonna in a minute, jump to and talk about how beautiful we were by Mbolo. But everyone who's worked in a war or conflict situation, um, and I've spoken, on my podcast itself, I've spoken to people who really will say war brings the best and out of humanity. It's like in equal measures. Um, and people surviving in war, even in my own work as well, in the humanitarian sector, working on conflict situations, you always get amazing stories of people who go out of their way far beyond to do kind acts of kindness in the
Yeah,
midst of really of madness, so it just brings out both of the best and the worst in us.
yeah, it is, and I'm sure you have a lot of stories to tell there from your work in the field.
Yeah. I think let's just move on to talk about, you already started it with the poem
Mhm.
itself. Maybe building on that, we can talk a bit more about how beautiful we were by Imbolo Mbuwe, which is such a fantastic book. I was very glad to also read it. I think I read it twice because we were also reading it for the Humanitarian Book Club and Read for Action. But tell me, what is this book about?
So the book, for me, it's really quite fascinating how it's been written. The first chapter itself starts from the narrative of the children, and it's quite unclear like who the children are, but essentially it's about the journey of a community, and particularly more focusing on one young girl, Tula, as she goes through a journey of pursuing activism, environmental activism, when the community in the village that she grew up in was exposed to the impacts of extractive oil pipelines that were built in the area and that actually caused a lot of death and sicknesses in the village. I hope that I've essentially summarized it um, like somewhat clearly, but I think the book is so much more than that. It's really so rich. In every chapter, the characters are just so complex. So there's a huge story within just every chapter.
No, absolutely. And I mean, the thing about also, I feel describing books, different people will summarize them differently depending on what really impacted them the most, I feel. So there's really just never a right way, I would say, to summarize a book. Um, but yeah, and you've already mentioned the environmental activism that is quite a core of the book. So it does, building a little bit on what you're saying, at the background of all of this, all of the characters in this village, Kosawa, is this company, Pexton, that is extracting oil and the impact on the community. and the environment and the culture of this village. And then brings in out of dynamics as well. But what are some of the themes that stood out for you in the book?
For me, the biggest one, and it was also something that I raised in the humanitarian book club discussion, was this um, like complete opposite, like different perspectives of how people going through the same journey or somewhat exposed to the same um, circumstances could result in different outcomes, right? So, for example, in this sense, is that Tula is a young girl, right? And she also has her brother Juba, and they're both facing the same crisis of Paxton's impacts on their health and on their communities. But Tula ends up growing to become an activist, while Juba lives the comfortable life of a government servant, and in fact, kind of feels the corruption, or at least reaps off of the benefit of that corruption a little bit. Um, and is quite comfortable with where he is and what the situation is. But so the question is really just like what drives somebody to resignation, sort of this acceptance of fate, in realizing that, oh, there's so much bad things happening around. Like, what's the point of even doing anything if it's not going to have an impact? So maybe that's Juba's perspective. And then the other side is Tula's end is, all of these things are happening and this injustice is happening. So I should um, act on it. I should act against it, right? And to create a community, organize everybody together, and to make sure that you rise up in solidarity and against all these injustices. So it's an interesting situation because I find that I reflect that a lot in what's happening in the real world, and in terms of like the climate crisis and the climate change movement, especially among young people, as I mentioned earlier, is what drives somebody to apathy, but also what drives them to action.
Yeah, no, and I'm also glad you really talk about that. It's difficult to to really figure it out. And I know we did discuss this on another conversation that you
Mm.
and I had. Um, and I wonder, even I mean, even when we are in a family unit, we are impacted by things differently. Even when we have the same experience, a shared experience as a family. But I wonder specifically for Juba as well, because he was, he almost died,
Yeah,
very early on in the book. Um, but I also, he also sees, he sees. I mean, they both see a lot of loss. You're right, but one of them, it drives her to act, and it drives him to go like, I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to fight with this. But is there a point, at least, if we're just sticking to the book, where for Juba, perhaps it feels like this is a battle we are not going to win, and I may as well just live my life and enjoy it, because he goes to school as well. He's educated and is able to take advantage of. I don't know. I don't know if he's taking advantage, but he
yeah,
gets opportunities. Let's put it that way.
yeah. Yeah, I don't know if, well, at least I can't recall a specific point, but I know, I'm sure there is. I do, however, recall one part in the book where, from the perspective of Juba, seeing his sister doing all her activism work and sort of just admiring her, but at the same time wondering like, why does she have to have to go through all these lengths when um, life for them at least can look a bit more different, or at least yeah, it's a really interesting conundrum, I guess. And I don't know, I don't really think that I have the answer myself. Is Yeah,
Yeah. And who is your favorite character in the book?
Conga, definitely. Yeah, and I think I echo a lot of other readers as well, especially when we're doing the humanitarian book club. But just this whole idea of Konga, the madman, the village madman, um, being the first person to rise against this injustice and to speak up, essentially, is for me such a strong message and strong symbol. This idea that you need a certain kind of madness to bring about some change into the world, and it's also from Konga that trickles. I mean, from Konga rising up that trickles down to Tula having a completely different, perspective of the world that she lives in, and shifting her life trajectory to go into her activism journey. So yeah, Konga doesn't. I mean, Konga didn't really have a long feature in the book, unfortunately, right? But he really created such a huge impact.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, Konga is my favorite character as well. And I agree with you. He actually, even when I asked Nimbolo that question at the panel for Read of Action, she also did say Konga was, her favorite character as well. Um, and yeah, he appears for a very short period. But I guess going back to the point you made at the beginning of our conversation about, issues are so big that there is a kind of paralysis for most of us. Where do you
Mm.
start from? What do you do? And, in some cases, like in the book, it takes, Konga to actually say, we can do something, and let's do something that actually really sparks action for this community.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I really admire about Konga, and it's him not really waiting for anybody, but so it raises the point of action being able to be effectively taken by the local actors themselves, so the ones who are facing this problem. And oftentimes, especially like in the work that we do, or at least in the work that I do in Planetary Health, is largely the narratives tend to come from the global north, whereas in the global south itself, in Malaysia, being in Southeast Asia, we also face the health impacts of climate change so closely. And so we sort of have to take on the position of Konga, where we say, like, hey, these are things that we are facing, these are our own lived experiences, and maybe there's a way that we can actually make action without having somebody else to tell us how to do it. So we do actually have the power themselves, and that's also sort of the central premise to the work that we do and how we emphasize in mobilizing the next generation of planetary health leaders. It's instead of empowering, because we believe that there's already so much power in there, but it's really just taking down all the barriers and making sure that it's effectively mobilized where the community is already there.
Right. And I mean, the book definitely, I also really like that aspect about it, of really looking at what the community, the people, the young people, the elderly people, Atula's grandmother, their role in addressing this environmental issue and really taking on Paxton right from a small village all the way to America, and really rooting for them to succeed. And I don't want to give away, too much of the book
Yeah.
itself, but you kind of really feel their pain, but you are also on this journey with them as they try to do what they can within the means that they have to take on both, the government itself, but also Paxton, who is at the core of the impact on the environment.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess one more thing that I notice is this idea of who's really the enemy in the book. And obviously, Paxton is like the biggest enemy there. But when you look at it, the lines are not so clear, and that's how it is in real life as well, I suppose. And it just goes to show how all of the work that we do and all is being made to thrive based on the systems that are designed for us, or at least being made to be broken because of the systems that are designed for us. um, yeah, and it makes the story quite beautiful. The characters are flawed, but it's about like the small steps that everybody takes in at least resisting certain comforts, or in the case of Tula, towards a greater like collective good. So yeah, it's really quite interesting there.
Yeah, but the book is also about love and
It
family,
is, yeah.
and yeah, there's a lot of. I remember when Tula's mother, I really love that story when she talks about how she met her husband, Tula's father, and how they fall in love. Of course, Tula's love story itself, her grandmother and her grandfather, all of these different stories of love and how that love evolved throughout the story
Yeah.
was also really beautifully done.
Yeah, in particular is definitely Tula's love story with Austin, right? And just how Austin was even introduced in the book itself
Hmm.
as the journalist that, brought their story out into the world, and then later on to
Hmm.
become, I feel like I'm spoiling too much, but
Yeah.
I suppose I needed to give a bit of context. Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry about that. But yeah, it's just really cool to see too, just how much Tula's love with Austin has evolved, as you rightfully say so, um, from something that's a lot more comfortable when she was abroad, but something that she had to like somewhat let go of, but became a source of strength for her to pursue her journey even further. So I guess, yeah, if we were to reflect this in, you know, what, even coming back to like original point of discussion of what drives people to action and all, it could also be love, right? And just seeing that these are the people who are affected by real world crisis, and we have the strength that's driven by love, and how do we act on it? If I'm not mistaken, the recent IPCC report had this very profound graphic of how a person in each generation will be impacted by by climate change, and it really shows how, even though we're here in this lifetime, but somebody that we know is going to be impacted by like the extreme of climate change, even after our passing. This could be like our children, our nieces or nephews, and all that. So there's the element. I think it's great to see a graphic like that because it makes it a bit more personal, and to say that this is somebody that you love that could potentially face this. So, well, should it not drive you to action, or what kind of future do you want for them to be facing,
Mm.
right?
It doesn't agree with you, I think, to me, and that's why I also like talking about stories. The more we can make these extension, I never can ever pronounce that word, but the more we can bring these big questions that we are struggling with to really, I mean, we talk about climate change. Probably today, everyone knows, you know, that climate change is impacting the world. I think at that level, probably we all know. But I think we haven't really internalized at a personal level what that is going to mean for us individually. And of course, for the generation that's to come. So I always feel, even when we talk about war in places where we are not, I think it's yes, I know the war in there's a war in Ukraine. Probably everyone in the world knows that today. But to really understand what that means for the people, in Syria, for the people who are caught up in conflict at a personal level, to me, the more we can really make that connection at a human level, the more I feel we will be able to relate. And then my
Yeah.
hope is always to at least do something about it.
Yeah, really, that's so true, and just making it more personal and relatable. And I think fiction storytelling in general has so much power in doing so. Um, if I just think about it on like my own personal experience, I've seen all these news about floods in Malaysia, right? They happen quite often, and even more so lately. But so I see them as news, and I would think like, oh, that's so unfortunate that this has happened. How can we help, like in terms of um, crowdfunding or anything? But I wouldn't understand the extent of it, emotionally, physically, mentally, until I actually faced, until my own house got flooded last 2 years, and in fact last year as well. It wasn't anything major, in like the whole house was flooded or anything, but it was still quite big. Then I never quite realized like the impact of it mentally. Like I became so worried that every time there's heavy rain, I would think like, oh no, if I'm in office, I would think my mom's at home. I should get back, like in case we're stuck and I can't get into the neighborhood because it's all flooded. The roads are all flooded. So it's that mental, the emotional aspect, but also, so much of the physical inconveniences and losses and damages that are not, losing my car because of it. So there's so much more of that I didn't quite understand until I really experienced it. But at the same time, maybe I could have understood better if through storytelling, like through personal storytelling and through fiction and books.
Yeah. No, and thank you for sharing that. And I'm going to wrap up our discussion. We can, of course, I have so many other things to talk about, how beautiful we were. But, Grab a Copy is such a beautiful book, How Beautiful We Were by Imbolo Mbuwe. And it just really makes you think about a lot of questions. Some of them Maisarah and I have discussed. My last question for you is, what one action can someone who is listening to this conversation take to address? I know your work is a lot on climate change and planetary health. So what is that one action that someone can take to address or improve health or generally climate change itself?
I guess first is to read the book, How Beautiful We Were. But no, I think also definitely read the book, but also just starting with conversations with the people closest to you. I think there is so much power in just bringing, starting conversations, and especially if it's coming from people um, that you trust, you tend to be a bit more receptive to it, and it really just opens up a whole new world and something that we might not necessarily think that the other people are also interested in. So just bringing up the topic of, hey, what can we do? Do you think that this is something worth doing, and if so, how? It's really small conversations, coffee chats.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I don't know if you have any questions for me.
I'm sure I have a lot on How Beautiful We Were. I guess like maybe the main question is, was there a particular scene from the book that really resonated with you?
I think to me the beginning of the book itself, the opening of the book itself is extremely, it's such an amazing opening, and I do like a lot when the author does, use the we when the children are speaking and sort of going on through their journey. But the scene that resonated with me the most, frankly, was at the beginning when Konga comes up with this idea to. And I don't want to spoil the book for people reading it. But yeah, that's that scene at the beginning of the book where Konga just gets the community to do something. I found that was one of the most powerful scene in the book. It's filled with tension, and as a reader, you're really wanting to find out what happens.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely one of my favorites as well.
Yeah. So thank you so much for really speaking with me today. Thank you so much for your time. I'm extremely grateful.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This is, it's always great to talk about literature and fiction and what we can do about how it influences us. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Maisarah today. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'd like to thank Melika Mensah, my co-producer, and the Nomadic Band for the music. Thank you.